Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2009, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate being recognized and having the privilege to address you here on the floor of the House of Representatives. And one of the things that I'm able to receive as I come down here and prepare for my hour here is an opportunity to listen to my colleagues and sometimes an opportunity to get an education. And if one listens carefully, Madam Speaker, there's a lot to be learned in this Congress. In fact, I believe that this is the most amazing educational experience that one could ask for. We're the center of information here in many ways. The Washington, D.C. is a magnet for information, and as members we have staff and committee people that aggregate that information at our request and give it to us in a means by which we can understand it, process it, and utilize it. In this information age that we have, this electronic era that we have, the Internet's full of information. The Library of Congress is full of information. There's all kinds of links out there. Many of them are very credible. Some of them are not very credible. And so we sort through, and we're always looking at what's the original source. How do you document the credibility? Well, you figure out who the person was that wrote it and their measure of credibility. And as I come to the floor and listen tonight, I'm rather amazed at what I've learned. I saw this long list of successes of the progressives. And I've lived through a fair amount of history by now, Madam Speaker, and I've studied a lot of history by now, and I had never equated the Revolutionary War to progressives. That's a new thing to me. That's a revolution to me. It's a revelation to me that it was the progressive group that decided that we should throw off the yoke of King George and grasp our freedom. It seems to me that it was the founding fathers and those who shaped this nation who put down in the document of the Declaration of Independence, that inspirational document, that our rights come from God. And that those rights that flow from God into man are granted willingly to the people. That's a structure that I guess you could call it progressive, but I haven't heard anybody on this side of the aisle that calls themselves progressive stand up and say that their rights come from God, or that there are natural rights, and there's a natural order to things, and it's ordered by the master of the universe. That's what our founding fathers believed. That was the inspiration that shaped America. It was the inspiration that brought about the Declaration, and it was the inspiration that caused the perseverance that allowed the United States to prevail over the British in the Revolutionary War. And a nation was forged on those fundamental values that haven't been openly rejected by the progressives, neither have they been embraced by the Progressive Caucus. But almost night after night I hear these things. The American Revolution, a success of the progressives. That is a new one. I have not heard that one before. The emancipation of the slaves. Well, that's an idea that is related to change. The institution of slavery had existed for thousands of years. But I didn't know that Abraham Lincoln and the abolitionists were considered to be progressives. I thought they were, Madam Speaker, Republicans. In fact, I'm sure they were Republicans. I have no doubt about it. The history of my family and the history of my understanding of the Republican Party, it was forged in order to abolish slavery. That's why they came about. That's why they formed together and nominated Abraham Lincoln, because he was the abolitionist candidate. The first Republican candidate, the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, emancipated the slaves. What would Abe Lincoln think if he were able to listen tonight and answer to the rhetoric that's here on the floor of the House of Representatives that claims that emancipation, the end of slavery, at the loss of 600,000 free people, gave their lives in the clash to put an end to slavery and to establish the states' rights issue and to tie the Union back together, all those things tied together. All of that blood that was spilled by the sword, that paid for the blood that was drawn by the lash, was spilled because Republican abolitionists stepped forward and said, we're going to put an end to the atrocity called slavery. They didn't think of themselves as progressives. I don't think the word existed in politics in the fashion that we hear it today. There are a group of progressives in this Congress today. I don't know how they associate themselves with this success of the American Revolution inspired by the rights that come from God, or the end of slavery that was paid for in blood and inspired and led by people who formed the Republican Party for at least in part, the specific purpose to abolish slavery. And then I go on and I see the national park system. It was Teddy Roosevelt. I guess I would call Teddy Roosevelt not a progressive. I would call him a populist, but not a progressive. So he was responsible for establishing the national park system. When I first looked at it, I thought, well, the progressive or the national pork system, I would agree with that, Madam Speaker. But no, the typo didn't exist. The chart said national park system. So let's give that to the prairie populists, or the populists, not the progressives. The civil rights for minorities and women was another piece on this poster board. Civil rights for minorities and women, passed by Republicans, majorities of Republicans. More Republicans voted for that, the Civil Rights Act in 1964, than did Democrats. It gets distorted if you read the history off the poster. If you go back and look at the reality and the facts of it all, it's entirely different. When I see rural electrification, it gets my attention. I don't know. There's been a couple of years in my life that I didn't use electricity that came from a rural electric cooperative. But every other year, most of the years of my life, that's been our primary source of power. And I know where rural electrification came from. My families grew up in farms that didn't have electricity. They remember when the first wire got out there to the end of the line, and they hung a light bulb in the barn so they could go out there and milk the cows in the dark, not by the lantern any longer, but by a 40-watt bulb that hung on a wire out of the ceiling of the barn. You pull a little chain, turn the light on, then you could milk in the shadows instead of the shadows of the light bulb, instead of the shadows of the flickering lantern. That got there because of cooperatives. Now, cooperatives, I believe you could, at the very closest you could bring them towards progressivism would be taking them towards populism. It was the people out on the prairie and in the open range, the LaGrange in the West, the populism that exists today within the politics of the people that are from where I live and points on west, that politics that decided we're going to settle this countryside, and we're not going to live out here and live in darkness without water, sewer water, or lights, or roads. We're not going to try to farm this countryside and take it back from the wilderness and turn it into a productive region, unless we can do it if we can bring electricity out, if we can bring services out, if we can bring telephone out. And so they went to work and they set up cooperatives. They didn't view themselves as progressives. They didn't even view themselves as populists. The people that established the RECs years ago, the rural electric cooperatives, and I have known many of them face-to-face personally as neighbors. Most of them passed away by now. They shaped their cooperatives because it was the only way they could get electrical power out to the farms. And I happen to have followed that history from the time it was shaped together when they decided to build their first power plant. The network that comes to my part of the country that flows all the way up from the South Crawford REC, now it's Western Area Power, or connected to Western Area Power, and then on up through Basin Electric, all the way up into the coal mines in Wyoming, which, by the way, Wyoming is one of the most punished states under the Waxman-Markey cap and tax piece of legislation. But they shaped this so that they could have electricity go to the farms, and they had to join together to do it. And they had to have a little help because it costs a lot more money to string a wire from farm to farm, a half a mile to a half a mile, than it does to string it from house to house in the city or into an apartment complex or into an office complex within a city. So they shaped the cooperatives to do that. I noticed on that board that took all of this credit for progressives, the accomplishments of creative individuals that wanted to simply operate in a free enterprise economy, that it didn't have our grain cooperatives there, but we established those too. The grain cooperatives, so that the farmer-owned cooperatives could set up a grain elevator to store and dry their grain and ship it and market it, and also mix and grind feed and sell fertilizer and chemicals and make this all work. It's the same kind of a function in the grain cooperatives as we had in our electric cooperatives. But in neither case was it progressives that put this together, just like it wasn't the progressives that fought and won the American Revolution or emancipated the slaves. In fact, of all of these things that I've listed, it was a majority of Republicans, if you would identify their politics, that brought about these changes, most of which are good changes or they wouldn't have been listed on that poster board. But I think it's revisionist history, Madam Speaker, and I could not let that moment pass without raising that issue. And now on to well, I'm just stick with this subject for a moment, Madam Speaker, because I know what a progressive is. And I think America needs to know what a progressive is. Now, it is not someone who has emancipated the slaves or fought and won the American Revolution or established a rural electric cooperative. Not somebody that did those things. It wasn't really somebody that they may have played a part in, but they weren't the central part, that established the civil rights. It's people that believed in the intrinsic value of the individual. They had the rights that come from God, regardless of what your race or ethnicity might be. That's not a progressive thought. That's a thought of rights that come from God. And so here's what a progressive is. And, Madam Speaker, anybody that's curious about this can just simply go to their Google page. That's one thing that hasn't been nationalized at this point. And they can just Google in there dsausa.org. That's the Democratic Socialists of America. dsausa.org. And the screen will come up, and on it will say, what is democratic socialism? And when you read through this website, which I happen to have right here, Madam Speaker, and I'll ask unanimous consent to enter this into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And this document that is the socialist website, peruse through it a little bit, dsausa.org, and it really doesn't take a very heavy read to figure out what's going on. These are the socialists. They say, we believe the social and economic decisions should be made by those whom they most affect. Sounds like a little bit of what's been going on with the major corporations in America. Sounds a little like what's happened to the auto industry. Looks like they've been taken over and nationalized by the White House and handed over to the unions for control. That would fit. We believe that social and economic decisions should be made by those whom they most affect. Here's another one. We believe that the workers and consumers who are affected by economic institutions should own and control them. Exactly what's happening to the automakers today. Today, as they pulled the plug on a good number of Chrysler auto dealers, as they threatened to pull the plug on an even greater number of General Motors auto dealers, and as the stock shares get handed over to the unions at the expense of the investors who were owners of the hard collateral of the business of Chrysler Motors, and now it looks like General Motors as well. Right off the web page of the socialists. We believe that the workers and consumers who are affected by economic institutions should own and control them. Social ownership could take many forms, such as worker-owned cooperatives or publicly owned enterprises managed by workers and consumer representatives. Not managed for profit, not managed for efficiency, but nationalized businesses run and managed by workers and consumer representatives. I started a construction company in 1975. I borrowed money, invested a lot of capital. And you know, the business is going on today. It's a second-generation construction company. My oldest son owns that today. There were a good number of places along the way that it would have been easy to give up and just drop out of business. But I had to make it work. I was determined to make it work. And if I had handed over the management to the company at any one of those critical points, they handed over the management of the company to the employees at any one of those critical points, there's no way that King Construction would have survived. This is quoting from the sheet again, while the large concentrations of capital in industries such as energy and steel may necessitate some form of state ownership, they're talking again about nationalizing. They say there are consumer goods industries that might be best run as cooperatives. So they want to nationalize large businesses where there's concentrations of capital, energy, steel, a couple examples. The automakers fall right in that. It says, and then it says that they are, and on here it says, well, we're not communists. Here's the difference. Communists are harder line than we are, and there's a few other distinctions. I'll ask you to read that, Madam Speaker, thoroughly. I think everybody in this Congress should know what the difference is between a communist and a socialist. I don't like either one. I like free markets. I like freedom. I like free enterprise. I like capitalism. And I like individual rights that come from God. And those are the pillars of American exceptionalism, not socialism, not Marxism, not communism. Here's another one. Pretty frequently asked questions. Private corporations seem to be a permanent fixture in the U.S., so why work toward socialism? Question mark. Here's the socialist answer. In the short term, we can't eliminate private corporations. Now, I think, Madam Speaker, that you've been convinced that the Democratic Socialists of America want to nationalize the major corporations, and they want to run this free enterprise economy, not as a free enterprise economy, but as a collectivist state operating businesses for the benefit of the workers and the customers without regard to profit or the investors. That is clear here. Also, what's clear in this document, which I will submit for the record, is that they no longer, the socialists are no longer hosting the website of the Progressive Caucus. Because in 1999, the issue was raised and the heat got a little too high. So the socialists that were managing the website of the Progressive Caucus, they decided, and the progressives decided they'd run their own website. So when you see Progressive Caucus come up on a blue board here on the floor, they're saying, go to our website, see what all we've got, look at all the credit we're taking for the things we didn't do. And by the way, they don't actually announce that they are the legislative arm of the socialists, which you'll find in this document that I'll introduce into the record this evening, Madam Speaker. And they say here in this document off the website of the socialist website that they are not a political party that nominates candidates under their banner, but what they do is their legislative arm is the Progressive Caucus. An absolute, undeniable link right here on the website. Socialists tied to progressives, that's what they are, Madam Speaker. And so I get a little disturbed when this Congress and the rest of the nation decides to try to mess with the definitions that Noah Webster wrote into our dictionary and our understanding of the English language. But we know what socialism is. If you want to find out what communism is, the socialists define it. If you want to find out what a progressive is, the socialists say progressives are them, their arm. And there's a list when you go on the website of 72 registered progressives in this Congress that are linked to the socialists directly as their legislative arm. And they are the ones advocating for the nationalization of our energy industry, for the oil refinery industry, for the nationalization of our automakers, for example. And all the way up the line, our financial institutions, the large insurance companies, the nationalization that's taken place from President Obama with the full support of the Progressive Caucus and most of the Democrats in this Congress and in the House and in the Senate, Madam Speaker. So I don't think that we can hold the rose-colored glasses along any longer. We've got to understand that our freedoms are being taken from us, and it's happening right under our very eyes, under our very nose, and the American people don't understand it yet. And when they go to the website and they read through this document, what is democratic socialism, on the website of dsausa.org, and look to the connection to Progressive Caucus. And then, by the way, go to the Progressive Caucus website. They put it up here. Just Google Progressive Caucus, and up will come a website that takes the credit for a lot of these things that they didn't have anything to do with. They didn't have an existence then during that period of time. But also, they won't take credit for the things that they advocate for that are a mirror image of what comes off the socialist website here. One and the same, Madam Speaker, and the American people need to know it, and they know it now. And so that's a little bit of what I didn't come here to talk about, Madam Speaker. But what I did come here to talk about is the nomination of one Don Johnsen to the Office of Legal Counsel. Don Johnsen is the President's nominee, and the Office of Legal Counsel, for the sake of those who are not all wrapped up in government, is the most important nomination that you've never heard of. And the Office of Legal Counsel, it's kind of a mini Supreme Court. They issue carefully worded opinions, and they're regarded as binding precedent, and they have the final say on what the President and all his agencies can and cannot legally do, Madam Speaker. So this is the person that has the opportunity to whisper into the ear of the President on a daily basis, on a regular basis, and make recommendations such as, Mr. President, do you or don't you have the authority to issue an executive order to close Guantanamo Bay? That would be one of those whispers into the ear of the President. It might well be a written document that would be formally handed to him as well. I use that as I'll say as an image, not so much a technicality. And so Don Johnsen is the person who has offended, I think, a greater number of Americans than any other nominee even those that didn't pay their taxes. And there's a long list of the things that Don Johnson has said and done. But I believe at this moment it would be useful if I could have the opportunity to yield to the very vigorous and energetic gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Schmidt, for however much time as she may consume.